If there is anything we have learned in the short history of this sport, it's that anything can happen in a fight. No favorite is ever safe and no bet is ever truly a lock. So many champions have lost their titles in fights that were supposed to be easy wins. Here are the top 10 greatest MMA upsets of all time. Number 10. Seth Petruzelli vs Kimbo Slice. There was a time when Kimbo was briefly thought to be a legitimate competitor in MMA. His aggressiveness, punching power, and massive following had him headlining Elite XC events on Showtime and CBS. Sure, the knowledgeable fans knew this guy did not deserve the attention and hype being thrown at him, but as I've stated many times, the knowledgeable fan is a very small minority in this sport. Still, most figured they were going to see another knockout win for the pseudo-face of MMA, especially because everyone tuned in to see Kimbo take on the ancient Ken Shamrock. But when Shamrock received a cut warming up for the fight, Elite XC scrambled to find the quickest replacement available. Light heavyweight Seth Petruzelli stepped in for Shamrock, and in the opening seconds, Kimbo rushed in as expected, only to be dropped by a single Petruzelli jab to the chin. Kimbo was stopped by one punch in 14 seconds and the farce was over. Number 9. Daiju Takashi vs Anderson Silva. Going into Pride 26, Anderson Silva was 4-0 in Pride and was next meeting a soft touch in 4-7 Daiju Takashi. Silva was taking his time in the fight and repeatedly gave up dominant positions. Takashi was motivated and never looked discouraged. Late in the first round, Takashi locked a triangle choke from the bottom and squeezed it until Silva tapped out. It made Takashi a notable name, but he was never able to capitalize off of it, ending with a record of 4-6-1 to this date. Number 8. BJ Penn vs Matt Hughes. After failing to win the UFC lightweight title on 2 occasions, BJ Penn instead jumped up in weight to challenge welterweight champion Matt Hughes for his title. Moments into the fight, Penn landed a very heavy right hand on the ground, dazing Hughes and forcing him to roll over, give up his back. Penn latched on a rear naked choke and Hughes tapped out. Penn was now the welterweight champion and tears flowed from his face. He would never get to defend the title due to contract disagreements with the UFC. Number 7. Keith Jardine vs Chuck Liddell. At UFC 76, Chuck Liddell was pitted against Keith Jardine in what most perceived as a main event constructed to build up a showdown between Chuck and the newly acquired Wanderlei Silva. Even though Chuck was coming off a knockout loss to Quinton Jackson, few were debating who would win the fight, but rather in what round Chuck would knock out Jardine. In a competitive 3-round war that saw both fighters knocked to the canvas, Jardine was able to squeeze out a split decision victory. It was a massive boost to the career of Jardine, who was coming off his own upset loss to Houston Alexander. The UFC decided to basically ignore the loss and went ahead with putting Chuck and Silva together at UFC 79. Number 6. Gabriel Gonzaga vs Mirko Cro Cop. To put it simply, Cro Cop was a legend of the sport, expected to come over to America and run right through the UFC heavyweight division, while Gonzaga was basically a guy nobody had heard of. Sure, Gonzaga had 3 wins in the UFC, but they were all on undercards against faces the average fan couldn't pick out of a lineup. This was to be Cro Cop's first UFC main event, and his last fight before fighting for the title against Randy Couture. The consensus was that Gonzaga was there to get beat. After a couple minutes of punishing ground and pound, the referee stood them up, seemingly a favor to Cro Cop. Seconds later, Gonzaga threw a right head kick that dropped the Croatian like a bag of bricks. Everyone watching was in a quiet shock, and many had immediate thoughts for Cro Cop's health. I remember just hoping he would be able to wake up. It was the beginning of Cro Cop's decline, and Gonzaga would go on to fight for the title, losing to Couture. Number 5. Joe Lauzon vs Jens Pulver. The UFC reinstated its lightweight division in 2006 after putting the division on hold for a couple years. At UFC 63, the only lightweight champion returned to the UFC. His first match was against young submission artist Joe Lauzon, who was a 7-1 underdog. In the first minute of the fight, Lauzon caught Jens with a left hook and dropped him. He finished it with punches on the ground, and the ref called off the fight at 43 seconds into the first round. The crowd was in complete shock, and Pulver's career began a downward spiral. Pulver has gone 1-6 since the loss, and Lauzon is now a talented rising contender in the UFC. Number 4. Kevin Randleman vs Mirko Cro Cop. Mirko Cro Cop was an early favorite in Pride's heavyweight tournament in 2004. Randleman was coming off 2 losses against Quinton Jackson by knockout and Kazushi Sakuraba by submission. Mirko had only lost once in Pride, and that was a fight he was winning against Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira before getting submitted in the second round. Randleman came forward and threw a powerful left hook that dropped Pro Cop. Immediately, Randleman pounced on his hurt opponent and knocked him out cold with punches on the ground. It was a quick and shocking defeat. Randleman went on to face Fedor in the next round, creating one of the most spectacular highlights in the sport by slamming Fedor on his head. Fedor still came back to win the fight. Number 3. Forrest Griffin vs Mauricio Rua. In 2007, Mauricio Rua was the number 1 light heavyweight in the world and was making his UFC debut. Forrest Griffin was just one fight removed from his devastating first-round knockout loss at the hands of Jardine, and was begging the UFC to be Rua's first opponent in the UFC. Griffin got his wish and the two met at UFC 76. After a competitive first half of the fight, and Forrest suffering a humongous gash on his forehead from a Rua elbow, Rua became noticeably exhausted. In the third round, Griffin took over and unleashed a series of blows to a grounded Rua. With just 15 seconds left, Forrest sunk in a rear naked choke and forced Rua to tap. Forrest ran across the ring celebrating and history was made. Forrest parlayed that win into a title shot, which he won. Number 2. Fabricio Werdum vs Fedor. After going undefeated in a career spanning 10 years that saw him become the Rings and Pride heavyweight champion, Fedor was set to meet Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ace Fabricio Werdum in a Strikeforce main event. In the opening minute, Fedor was swinging for the fences and Werdum fell to his back. Fedor charged in without any caution and tried to finish the fighter that he thought was hurt. Werdum was not hurt and he quickly locked Fedor in a triangle choke. Fedor struggled to get out and Werdum pulled an arm bar to boot. After about 30 seconds of being stuck in the choke, Fedor gave one solid tap. It was the end of an era. The great Fedor had tasted defeat and MMA would be changed forever. Werdum would finally get credit for being a top heavyweight. Before we finish the video, if you enjoyed this content, like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the notification bell to get the latest videos from MMA on the go. Now what many call the number 1 upset in MMA history. Matt Serra vs George St. Pierre. After winning Season 4 of The Ultimate Fighter, Matt Serra was awarded a title shot against George St. Pierre. Most considered this more of a punishment than a reward, assuming Serra was in for quite a beating from the unstoppable-looking champion. St. Pierre had just won the title from Matt Hughes at UFC 65 in dominant fashion with a second-round head kick TKO. Serra was figured to be an easy first defense for the new champ. The two met at UFC 69, with most betting odds listing St. Pierre at around a -1,000 favorite. After a few minutes of feeling each other out, Serra connected with a right hook on the ear of St. Pierre. With the champion clearly wobbled, Serra pounced on him with a series of punches, knocking him down and finishing him with strikes on the ground. The bout lasted less than 3.5 minutes. Serra was the new champion and St. Pierre would be forced to reassess his career.